All right, I'm Ken Bennett. I'm the Secretary of State, and I appreciate all of you being here this evening. A lot of people ask, what does the Secretary of State do? And probably the most important thing the Secretary of State does is serves as the Chief Elections Officer in the state. But as soon as I tell people that the Secretary is the Chief Elections Officer, I also like to remind them that the state of Arizona does not own one piece of equipment to count an election or print a ballot or count the ballots. All of that is owned by the local county. So we work very closely with the county election officials and recorders to run the elections. We also have a business services division in the Secretary's office where partnerships and trademarks and trade names and notaries and some other business type transactions get recorded here in the state. And then we have the library and archives division of the state where we keep track of all of the records of the state, and all of the official acts of government are filed in the Secretary of State's office, whether it's executive orders or the bills that the legislature passes and that. So it's very much a record-keeping office, and I've enjoyed being the Secretary for the last year, and I've decided I was going to run again for Secretary. The other thing that the Secretary of State serves as is our Lieutenant Governor, because we don't have a Lieutenant Governor in Arizona. Secretary of State is first in line to take over, as has been the case with some regularity over the last many years. This is kind of an interesting piece of trivia, the last governor to be elected to office and serve their full 8 years was Jack Williams.
That's right.
1967 to 75.
It hasn't happened since.
It has not happened since that a governor was elected and served their full 8 years. Everyone either left early or was impeached or whatever, or came in early or whatever. Now, I also kind of view the Secretary of State office as imparting information and keeping track of what the state of Arizona does. And before I became the Secretary, I was asked by a business colleague of mine to explain the state budget to one of her women's clubs. It was at a luncheon, and they were called the Creative Women of Pinnacle Peak. And I fretted for weeks, how do I explain the state budget creatively? So I came up with a way of explaining the state budget using Kleenex boxes. Each Kleenex box is $1 billion of spending that the state does each year. And they're kind of color-coded. The yellow is the general fund. Most of the time when you're hearing about the state budget, you're hearing about something called the general fund. The general fund is the largest pot of money that the governor and the legislature has to decide how to spend each year. And until very recently, the general fund is about $10.5 billion a year. The larger half of the general fund comes from sales taxes that are collected throughout the state, and the other half, slightly smaller than 50%, comes from income taxes. You notice I didn't mention anything about property tax. The state does not use any property tax. Most of the property taxes collected throughout the state go to local governments like cities and towns and counties and school districts and fire districts and things like that. But at the state level, the general fund is about $10.5 billion.
Sales tax?
Sales tax and income tax go to the general fund. Of the $10.5 billion that goes into the general fund is spent each year, about half of it, or $5 billion a year, goes to the kindergarten through 12th grade school system. Almost half the general fund goes to schools. Then there's about 10% that goes to higher education. That's of course, the 3 state universities and the community college system. They're a little over $1 billion a year, as is the prison and court system. The prison and court system gets a little over $1 billion. These two combined, higher education and prisons and courts, spend about $2.5 billion a year. But the higher education is the larger of those two, so I'll put the half there. Then there's about $2.5 billion a year out of the general fund that goes to health and welfare spending. Now the largest chunk of this 2.5 goes to the indigent health care system for families that are below the federal poverty limits, called ACCESS, Arizona Healthcare Cost Containment System. But this $2.5 billion also includes Department of Health Services, Department of Economic Security, Child Protective Services, Department of Developmentally Disabled, the state mental hospital, the state lab, long-term care for the elderly, a lot of health and welfare related programs. All the rest of state government that the legislature and governor have to decide how to spend each year adds up to about $500 million. It's about 150 state agencies, some very small, the Lettuce Council and the Funeral and Embalmers Board, and all the way up to the governor's office and the legislature and the attorney general and the treasurer and the secretary of state, and then all of the state agencies, the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Commerce and Tourism and Veteran Affairs and Revenue and banking and insurance. But all of them combined add up to about $500 million. So there's the general fund. That's the $10.5 billion that we spend each year. Almost half to education, about a fourth to health and welfare, about 10% to higher education, about 10% to prisons and courts, and everything else combined adds up to about 5%. There's a second group of money the state keeps track of. It's called other funds, and usually they are funds that are collected on specific activities, but the money has to be spent in those areas. For example, there's about $1 billion a year that goes to transportation. This $1 billion comes from two primary taxes. The biggest one is fuel taxes, when you buy gasoline or diesel fuel for a vehicle. The other tax that makes up this $1 billion are the license tag renewals that we pay each year to renew our license tags. The fuel taxes and the license tag fees add up to about $1 billion goes to transportation. There's also about $1 billion of these other funds that ends up in health and welfare. This $1 billion comes from taxes on two products. You can probably guess what they are. Cigarettes. Alcohol and tobacco. Okay, those taxes generate about $1 billion a year, but it almost all gets spent in health-related programs. Then there's about $500 million of these other funds that ends up in higher education, and there's about $500 million of a whole bunch of them added up together. That's about $500 million. So now we're up to $13.5 billion of spending between the general fund and these other. And before I go to the last category of state spending, it's important, especially in education, to realize that in addition to the state money, the schools collect and spend property tax that's collected at the local level. For example, in the K-12 schools, all of the school districts, 227 school districts throughout the state, all of the school districts combined collect and spend about $4 billion a year. I have to stick this in here. It's called propping up the state budget.
Yeah.
So how do they,
They do that. Well,
what's that, $4 billion then?
This is the local property tax
Okay,
that is collected, and it goes directly to the schools
okay.
from those local property tax owners, both business and personal and individuals.
Man.
That also includes bonds and overrides that you are periodically asked to approve at the local level that's based on property tax. Just like the K-12 schools who have access to property tax, the community college system throughout the state collects and spends about $1 billion of property tax. So if you looked at your property tax bill, there's a pretty big chunk that goes to K-12 schools. You'll have some going to cities and counties, fire districts, and some local governments. Usually a pretty good chunk to community colleges, and then a few other little ones. But the community colleges, their governing boards set a tax rate each year and collect and spend that along with the state money. The universities do not. The universities don't get property tax. They just get state money and some federal money, which is the last category of state spending. It's called federal and non-appropriated monies, meaning most of it is federal, but it doesn't go through the legislature's process each year of deciding how to spend it. It usually goes directly to the state agencies that receive it, and they decide how to spend it along with the state money. For example, there's about $2 billion a year of federal money that comes into the K-12 school system. Most of the federal money for schools is related to special education students and their needs, their additional expenses. There's also about $2 billion federal and other money that comes into the higher education system.